Okay, next up we have Jon C. Day. Jon is with the Australian Research Council Centre for Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at JCU and focuses his work on applying the Climate Vulnerability Index, a rapid assessment tool used in many heritage areas. Over to you, Jon. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to start by acknowledging traditional owners of the area in which we meet today and their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the living culture and connections to the country of the traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef, associated with the Great Barrier Reef. I want to give you a talk about our project, which is based around the cultural values that have been ascribed by the Yuku Baja Muliku community. But I first want to just acknowledge my collaborators and co-authors. Karin Gerhardt, many of you know, from the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. Larissa Hale. Larissa wears many hats, an amazing lady. She's Managing Director of YBM for the Land Trust. She was a major person in the Land and Sea Ranger program and in their Junior Ranger program. And Scott Heron from JCU. Scott's an Associate Professor in Physics and the co-developer of the Climate Vulnerability Index with myself. YBM country, for those of you who don't know, is south of Cooktown and includes parts of 2 Australian World Heritage areas, both the Great Barrier Reef and the wet tropics. This map shows the agreement area for YBM, and the Annan River forms the northern and western boundary. The colours on the map show land tenure, and so that large areas of light green are actually part of the Annan River National Park. And so this is areas of significant rainforest, woodlands, mangroves, salt pans and beaches. The Tumara area shows the YBM Sea country, which extends way out off Archer Point, over 60 kilometres offshore. This quote from ICOMOS, the international body responsible for cultural heritage, I think is really important, summarises the impacts. As you can see there, climate change has become one of the most significant and fastest growing threats to people and heritage worldwide. So climate change is having unprecedented implications for traditional knowledge and for things like their seasonal calendars. One of the YBM rangers, when we talked about their Indigenous seasonal calendar, said, it's all out of whack. It's way out of whack. This is an example. This is a wattle tree that YBM used to use as an indicator. At certain times of the year it flowered, which was an indication of when the certain type of fish was ready to be caught. But because of climate change, that's now flowering at a different time of year, which is out of sync with the fish. This is an example relating to fire management. Again, we hear about traditional use of fire as a key tool, but today the burning window is completely different because of climate change. And so what we used to see as low intensity fires are now unable to be undertaken. And when they do occur, they're usually high intensity fires, which has real impacts on species. When Scott and I developed the CVI, it was initially aimed at looking at World Heritage. And here's some of the reports that we've done for World Heritage. But having now widely applied it, we want to see about how we could apply the CVI to areas like Indigenous areas and assessing their climate impacts. So that's how this project came about. As you can see, the CVI is values-based. So key values are foundational. We've heard a lot about values at this workshop. We use the best available science, both Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. And as far as possible, CVI is community-based, community-focused, which brings the community into the assessment process. And in YBM, that includes the key rangers, the elders, junior rangers, and others in the community. So once YBM decided they wanted to take the project, they identified for us 12 key values that they want to assess. Some of these, as you can see, are single species, things like crocodiles or mussels. Some are broad locations like the Annan River. Some of them are traditional processes like fire management, traditional hunting. And one was a culturally specific site for women's business. I'll explain how we assessed each value in a minute, but at a subsequent workshop, the community decided to add in 4 additional values for assessment. And it was really fascinating to hear their stories. For example, the story about the role of green ants as part of their traditional medicine. And then also to hear about what's happening under climate change. I don't have time to go into all logistics about the leading up to our workshop, and I think this is a really important part, and we've heard from people like Ames what they're doing. But I want to say that right from the start, Karin Gerhardt from the foundation was extremely helpful. We wouldn't have got the project through without Karin's role. I also want to address the sort of issues like walking country. And so we've spent time walking country with elders and rangers, and they really helped us appreciate the stories they were going to share. This is some of the rangers sharing their knowledge, and also a smoking ceremony as part of the Welcome to Country. You're going to see a few of these no photos icons on my following slides, my results slides, so please respect that. We're hoping to publish some of this work, so we'd like you not to tweet it and take photos at this stage. So in the first workshop, we spent time doing storyboards, as you can see here. We started with an image of the value in the middle of the butcher's paper. And here I want to acknowledge the artwork done by some of the traditional owners, Irene and Larissa. Then we worked with the workshop to identify what they saw as the historic perspective of that value, what they thought it was like 50 years ago, a contemporary perspective of the value, what's happening today, and then having discussed climate change, what they thought about the expected future perspective, given the likely climate stresses. As they spoke, these were written down on the butcher's paper, as you can see here. Also noted were other pressures on the values, things beyond climate change and their current management practices. The table on the right-hand side shows how we took that information and put it into a standardised format. So this was populated after the workshop, summarising information that they'd given us on the worksheets, so in this case for fire management. The summarised information was then brought back to the community in the second workshop, so we could check the format and check the information, getting them to validate it. They requested some minor changes, but overall the community were relatively happy with the way we had summarised it in that form. I want to stress though, the intention moving forward is not to use one or the other. We're basically using both. Previous CVI assessments in World Heritage had used these criteria derived from IUCN documentation. But during the YBM workshop, it became very clear this sort of technical wording was not appropriate for Indigenous people. You know, what does good with some concern mean? So the workshop decided to develop their own assessment criteria, which was a really exciting and important part of the project. So working through each of the defined criteria led them to come up with revised names, very bad, etc., and more meaningful terms to describe each of those criteria. It was also important that the community recognised this could apply to both tangible and intangible values. The community then used the new assessment criteria to assess a subset of those key values that they'd identified. Looking down the middle column, you'll see that current condition, there's only one value regarded as dark green as very good. 3 were good, but 5 are assessed as concerning. Looking down the recent trend column on the right, only 2 values were assessed as having improved. The rest were assessed as deteriorated. There are many lessons from this work, and this could go on for pages. I've only got one. But many of these lessons were Scott and I as the Western scientists, but I think we all learnt a lot from the process. The entire process needed to be led by YBM as holders of the traditional knowledge. I also want to stress again the value that Karin Gerhardt played as a knowledge broker. Prior to arriving in the community, it was important that we agree on a cultural methodology. Relationship building with the Indigenous people takes time, and we've heard this a number of times during the workshop, but you have to earn that trust, and it also takes a lot of effort. So things like walking country were really important. Again, it might be obvious, but you've got to find out the right people to speak for country. And then most important for us is to listen and learn. Indigenous people often tell stories to explain their knowledge, and we need to respect and learn from those stories. Be aware that there are non-verbal cues when discussing issues. Some of these are really important, and respect the views of elders. To date, we've got 2 co-authored publications out of this project, one in an Indigenous-focused journal, and the second article in The Conversation, which we're really happy has reached over 10,000 readers. We've got growing interest in this project, and we've been invited to give it the same sort of work at 2 international conferences next year. And I want to leave it at that, but in doing so, I want to give special thanks to the Foundation, Again, to Karin Gerhardt, a shout out for her key part as a conduit between us and YBM, and lastly to the community, especially the elders and rangers. Thank you.